What is the Volunteer Match Network? Imagine a world of volunteers looking for their perfect match.
When a nonprofit posts a volunteer opportunity on Volunteer Match, that opportunity has the potential to reach millions of interested volunteers. To illustrate the reach of our network, let's imagine that this piece of candy represents 10,000 people.
An average of 15 million people visit volunteermatch.org each year. In addition, each volunteer opportunity has the potential to reach 10 million pro bono and skilled volunteers through LinkedIn's volunteer marketplace. 2.6 million employee volunteers search for our opportunities from companies like Starbucks, Groupon, and JetBlue. And more than 500,000 employee volunteers from multiple corporate giving platforms have access to volunteer opportunities from our network. Since 1998, Volunteer Match has facilitated over 12 million nonprofit volunteer connections. Now that you know more about the reach of our network, get started by going to volunteermatch.org and posting your volunteer opportunity today.
Hello, and welcome to Authentically Engaging Families, Improving Outcomes by Partnering with Offending Parents. I am Kavalin Day, and I'm so excited to have you here. Before we begin, I'd like you to stop and take a moment to think of a parent or a couple parents who you may have had at some point a difficult time engaging, somebody who you've struggled to communicate with, or maybe even somebody you just had a hard time getting along with. This might be a parent who actually is the offending parent in a situation. This might be a parent of a client of yours. But just think of a parent where you say, I know this is a parent that I needed to connect with and I really struggled to connect with them. What I'd like you to do is put the name of that person, that parent or parents, on a piece of paper in front of you. I'd like you to put them in the front of your mind as we go through this activity, because I really believe that if you can take what we're talking about today and apply it to that situation, you'll really be able to use these strategies in an ongoing way in the future. Now, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here for this wonderful opportunity. I would like to introduce myself to those of you who are not familiar with me. I did say my name is Kavalin Day. I am a wife, mother of 4 daughters, and a grandmother of 2 precious grandsons. In the state of Indiana, I'm a licensed school counselor, but I practice mostly now as a family coach, family and business coach here in Indianapolis. I do a fair amount of work with the Department of Child and Family Services. I work directly with children and their offending or non-offending parents, but I also do a great deal of work with foster parents. And so I know how challenging it can be when you're caring for the kids and you're frustrated by what the parent might be doing that the child might be going back to. So I have a special place in my heart for this subject matter, and I'm really excited to be talking to you about it today. I do have over 15 years of experience in and around schools, doing everything from volunteer work as a daycare worker or a Girl Scout leader, but most of my experience now comes in the form of consulting and coaching and professional development of educators. I am an author and a speaker. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But today we're going to talk about how we can improve outcomes for children and families by focusing on the parents who may have been the one to actually have hurt them. Now, our goals for today are to really understand the term offending parent and talk a little bit about why it's important to focus on them as we want to improve outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about some of the barriers, because I do want to acknowledge that there are some challenges to successfully working with offending parents. But then we're going to also talk about some of the intervention strategies that I've used and that others are using to building that therapeutic alliance that we know is necessary for change, but specifically as we focus on parents who may be in the position of having caused harm to their kids. So the term offending parent is one that you may or may not be super familiar with. When you look at therapeutic interventions, specifically when we're talking about abuse and neglect of children, almost always you will see the majority of the information you will find is on the non-offending parent. So that would be the parent who has not been accused of or suspected of actually causing harm to their child. So it stands to reason that the offending parent is the one who we believe has actually been involved in one way or another in physical abuse or sexual abuse, or what I see most often is neglect. I don't know for those of you who are familiar with in the state of Indiana, we've gotten some bad press over the last year or two because of the opioid epidemic. It's kind of taking over in some of our more rural areas of the country and now dabbling, spreading out across the state, making us get some really negative statistics about the health and well-being of the children in our state. But the most of that is coming from what we would call neglect, where either a parent is under the influence of illegal substances, or exposing their children to illegal substances, or even just abandoning their children because they are intoxicated and not able to provide a safe and stable home for them. So any of those might be considered an offending parent. So let's jump right in and focus on the giant elephant in the room, which is, why do we want to focus on the offending parents? For most of the time, when we talk about child welfare work, we really are focusing on the child. We're focusing on giving them appropriate coping skills, helping them to navigate the world after having experienced abuse or neglect. And so when we talk about why to focus on offending parents, that is a conversation that you won't necessarily hear a ton of people talking about. Most of the time we just say we want to protect the children from their parents, which is obviously one way we want to spend our energy. But there's lots of good reasons why we actually want to focus on also treating the parent. So let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, on any given day in this country, there are nearly 428,000 children in foster care in the United States of America. In 2015, over 670,000 children made their way through the system at one time or another. So we're talking about nearly 1 million children every single year are in the foster care system. And by and large, most of those kids will ultimately go home. The research that I saw was according to childcare.gov, as many as 51% of these children will ultimately return to their parents' care at some point. And so if we don't focus on how to make sure that the parents are able to accept those kids back, we're really setting the kids up for that cycle of abuse to continue. So if we recognize that most kids ultimately do go home, we know that there's a high value in focusing on parents. Now, I mentioned that I do a great deal of work with foster parents in my state, and I can tell you that even the kids who age out in the system, so those the 49% who quote unquote don't go home, a majority of them do end up after their 18th birthday reestablishing some type of a relationship with their birth parents or their birth families. So even if they don't technically go home, that relationship, that kinship bond is still there. And for most kids, when there's the opportunity to do so, they will reestablish that relationship. Now, many offending parents are also victims. So if we think about the humanity of the parent that we're working with, they too have oftentimes been victimized. Now, there's no data that tells us that being a victim of child abuse or neglect will ultimately force you into a life of being an abuser. But what I can tell you from working with many offending parents is that a great many of them do have a history of trauma, abuse, or neglect themselves. Because of that, we don't want to be in the position of re-victimizing them by treating them as a failure. It's important that we recognize that we want these parents to now have an opportunity to heal their own trauma so that they can go on and build that bridge for their children. Next, partnering with parents gets you the best information. I'm going to tell a story here about a child that I work with, actually when I was in the school system, and he was a kindergartner. He came to our school maybe midway the first semester, and I was kind of surprised because when I talked to mom, he's one of those kids where his reputation kind of preceded him. I worked part-time at a school, and so by the time I got into the school, he'd been there a few days, and everyone was kind of waiting at my door to tell me what I needed to know about this student. But by the time I talked to mom, I was surprised because she made the statement to me that the school she had previously taken her son to for kindergarten had invited her to unenroll him. He wasn't suspended by her count. He wasn't expelled. They just told her that he wasn't quite ready for kindergarten. Now, if you're like I was at the time, I was thinking like no school would tell you that, but I did end up finding out that the school did tell her that. But they had told her that because they recognized that his behaviors were more than what they could handle, and they didn't want to go through the process, of actually suspending him and expelling him or, testing him for special education. But when I was presented with that from mom, it was information that I never would have known without having had that conversation. Ultimately, I went on and then did a home visit with mom and had a conversation with her. I invited her to have whoever she wanted to have at home. So we ended up with some extended family members, grandparents, friends. There was a house full of people really by the time I got there. And the information that I got from that meeting, which was about an hour of my time on probably like on a Wednesday afternoon, the information that I got from that meeting led me to believe that this wasn't just a behavioral issue. I recognized the signs of autism and was able to advocate for this child getting some special education testing, which ended up getting him qualified for special education as well as a myriad of services because he did end up being on the autism spectrum. Had I not partnered with this mom to get that information, we would have maybe been just like the other school, recognizing him as a behavioral concern and treating him accordingly. A lot of times, now that was a mom, because she had some attendance issues with her son, she might have been seen as being neglectful, but at the end of the day, she was doing the best that she could at the time. And so partnering with her gave me a little bit better information on how to help her and ultimately help him. So partnering with parents does get you the best information. And then lastly, and I think this is one we don't really talk a lot about, but it's really important to note, empowering parents is good for clinician care. If you don't know, there's a shortage of child welfare workers in most areas of this country, especially in the direct kind of government role, but also in some of those more ancillary roles in terms of therapy and case management services, because very oftentimes our social workers and clinicians are getting burnt out because they're so overwhelmed by the demand and overwhelmed by the need, and it's a high stress situation. When you partner with parents, you're doing a little bit less of the work rather than focusing only on giving the child everything that they need from you. You encourage and empower the parents, and that really is good for you because you are able to achieve better results with less work on your part. It also helps you to see the parent in that, in their best version of their humanity. If you're looking at parents from an angry or an adversarial role all the time, it really does tend to wear on you and wear you out. When you feel like you're partnered with them, you're less likely to have that perspective, which makes you likely to be more successful as well. Which then leads us to why not focus on parents, right? So now I've got you kind of thinking about the benefits of partnering with parents, but I'll be honest with you, there's lots of challenges when you start to have this conversation. So some of the challenges that you might see. So first of all, family members, whether they are offending or non-offending, may be naturally distrustful of you and in the role of a therapist or a clinician. They may have cultural reasons why they don't believe in therapy. They may think that every word that you're kind of picking apart every word they say to kind of tell the judge or to turn them in. especially if they're already on probation or if they have some pending criminal charges. They definitely are going to be more hesitant to working towards you. Occasionally, they're just flat out unavailable, either because they're working multiple jobs or maybe they're involved in some having to be, face penalties because of what they've done. They may be unavailable to participate in services with you. And sometimes they're just flat out unwilling. They know the value, but they're not willing to acknowledge their role, or they're not willing to acknowledge that this is necessary. And so they just simply are not willing to participate in services. All of those are challenges that might prevent you or make it harder for you to partner with parents. Occasionally, there's also some logistical barriers. The amount of time that you have, that you're giving to your clients that you actually are working with, whether they be the child or the non-offending parent, looping in that offending parent might mean one extra set of hours. It might mean more time on the phone. It might mean more phone calls. It might be more emails. You might have to try and coordinate something. And that means that there's logistical barriers. The access that you have might be a challenge as well. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the personal beliefs, because I really think that might make the biggest difference, because that is a challenge. And I do want you to take a minute to kind of do a self-check here. I like to kind of say, check yourself so that you don't have to have other people check you. What are your personal beliefs about what they've done? If you get into a child welfare work situation or a social work situation, you're not doing this because you want to hurt children. You're obviously doing this because you care about improving outcomes for children and families. And that's a wonderful characteristic. So it's natural, completely natural, that you're going to have some personal feelings about what this offending parent may have done to or their child, or that affected their child. It's okay to have those feelings, and you have to acknowledge those feelings. What it's not okay to do is to let those feelings prevent you from taking the necessary steps to working with this parent. And that's for all the reasons we've already mentioned. So what I want to talk about now is the collaborative care approach. In my book, Authentically Engaged Families, I talk a lot about how to have an approach to partnering with families that is more successful than what we've typically done in the past. And I think this also applies to working with offending parents, because it really puts the parents in the center of what we're trying to do, as opposed to some kind of an ancillary or add-on part of the process. We're going to talk about setting a clear vision for working with parents, how to create a plan that is sustainable and effective, and then what action steps you can take to do that. Now, you may have your own vision of what it means to be a good parent, right? It might involve some appropriate communication, some quality one-on-one time. It may even include both parents sitting at the table, kind of working towards the common goal of achieving positive outcomes for your children or your clients. I absolutely understand that, but I want you to take a minute to think about that person that you've written down this morning. What are their visions for their child? The truth of the matter is that every parent has a dream for their child, and improving outcomes for children requires that parents be able to see, believe, and achieve a vision for their family that is happy, healthy, and whole. And the reality is they may not have that. Parents don't abuse their children for fun. There's always going to be a breakdown that has occurred to cause that type of behavior. And so your first step is really helping to create a vision that doesn't include abuse. And that's going to take a little bit of time. And so we're going to talk about how you do that. So I love this quote, and it says, building relationships with families is about honoring the hopes and dreams for their children. So it's about recognizing that even when a parent isn't doing what's right, that they still have a dream for their child. So a question for you. Do you believe that every parent has a dream for their child? Now, note that I'm not asking you, does every parent do what's necessary for their child? I'm not asking you if every parent is a good parent, but I'm asking you, do you believe that every parent actually has a dream for their child? So then the next question becomes, what is your role in that dream? These are questions that I think are really important when we're talking about working with offending parents. Because what it helps you to realize is that the parent who has been in the position of causing abuse, neglect, or harm to their child in some way has really gotten off track of their dream for their child. And your role, oftentimes in that situation, is to help them get back on track in a way that allows them to support their children developing well. So empowering vision in families really begins with a couple steps. So we're going to start with meeting the parent where they are. So understanding that parents who come to you as an offending parent may have a vision of what a family looks like that is very dysfunctional. Like I said, a vast majority of the families that I work with, the Department of Child and Family Services, those parents have been through significant abuse or neglect. And so their idea of what a healthy family looks like is a pretty far cry from what my vision of that might be. Your first step is to just figure out where they are. What does a healthy family look like to them? If they define themselves as a mother or a father, what does it mean to be a mother or a father? Help them to verbalize that, describe that, and then you can begin to find those moments or those pieces of their definition which are healthy and that can be the foundation for what the work that you're about to do. Next, I want you to build rapport with that unconditional positive regard. How many of you remember unconditional positive regard from graduate school? It's definitely something that I think a lot of us still don't quite understand, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on there. So when we talk about unconditional positive regard, it really is a foundational principle of several counseling theories, but you may remember it from Carl Rogers' person-centered counseling techniques. Many people still don't quite understand how to effectively express it with clients, however. So there's a couple steps that I like to share with people. So first of all, you're believing your client and that they have the ability and the right to help themselves. So do not see yourself as a savior in this situation. It's really easy, especially when you're working with a parent who has made some negative choices, to see yourself as kind of the savior coming in to rescue either their children or them from themselves. But what you really want to assume is that they have the best intentions, even if they're not doing that right now. What that allows you to do is see those strengths like we talked about, and then begin to affirm them in their positive steps. Next, what you don't have to do is actually like your client, but you do have to convey to them that you are not in a position to judge them all day and all night. Raise your hand if you would like to sit across from someone who you feel is judging you every time you open your mouth. Yeah, none of us raised our hand, because the reality is no one wants to be judged all day. And those offending parents, especially those who have at least an inkling of the fact that they've made a bad choice, they know that what they've done is wrong. And what they're expecting you to do all day is judge them, which means they have even that more reason to avoid you or avoid the conversations that you want to have. And then last, you want to encourage, model, and practice self-compassion. Like I said, once you got the parent to the position where they're actually willing to engage with you, a lot of times what you'll find is that they begin to feel ashamed of the actions that they have taken. If you've ever done any work or listened to anything by Brené Brown, she talks a lot about the fact that shame is a very powerful emotion, and it can hinder us from our healing. And so you want to make sure that you are encouraging them to practice some self-compassion. That doesn't mean ignoring the mistakes that they've made, but looking at the behavior and separating the behavior from who they are as a person versus blaming them as a person for every behavior they've taken on. A lot of parents, we think we want them to own their behavior, which makes sense in one regard, but once I've connected myself with the behavior, it's really hard for me to see myself separate from it. So we want to move on to identifying some strengths so we can build on them. And the way we do that is to kind of separate them from those behaviors so that they begin to see those behaviors as not their norm. In my book, Drag 'em Kicking and Screaming, I talk about becoming a strength investigator. Like I recognize that when you're sitting in front of a client who has abused their child or neglected their child in some way, it might be hard to find a strength. But the truth is, if you can't find a strength to build on, they never will be able to. So you really need to work hard to look for those small glimmers of hope and focus on them so that they can grow. Next, let's talk about our plan. Now, understand that a plan is both the decision to make a change and the details of that change, okay? So at some stages of this process, you're going to be heavily steeped in the details, telling them exactly what they need to do on a step-by-step basis. Other times, you're just focusing on helping them to decide that this is the right thing to do. We're going to talk a little bit about motivational interviewing in a minute, and that really does help with that. But the important part here to remember is that this plan needs to be co-created. You are not the savior. You are not here to kind of railroad the clients or push them into changing their behavior. You really want to make this something that they can become invested in. Recognizing and respecting cultural differences is a huge component to this. I have kind of built myself a reputation as a countercultural parent, in that as an African American Christian woman, I don't believe in spanking my children. And I've actually had clients who've chosen to come work with me because they believe that that's the truth, that you shouldn't, physically discipline your children. But when I work with a client, I recognize that they may have a deeper connection to that cultural norm, which is that, physically spanking your children is appropriate. We have to recognize and respect those cultural differences in order to help a client see the benefit in doing something different. This is also a great stage to invite different perspectives, and this includes hearing the story of the child who may have been the victim in this case. It's important that as we create this plan for change, we understand that there's going to be spaces all throughout this where we need to revise the plan. Nothing is set in stone, and that usually gives my clients a lot of comfort as they understand that we'll change this as we need to. We just have to agree to keep having the conversation. And then you also want to recognize that the role of working with offending parents, although there's definitely a place for being a therapist and digging deep, a lot of what you're doing is coaching them, okay? Now, as a coach versus a therapist, what we a lot of times think about is that coaches have a goal of motivating, supporting, encouraging, and creating confidence for their clients. Think of yourself if you were in a situation where you had made a bad decision that hurt your child, and now you recognize that that was a bad decision and you want to change. Do you need someone who makes you feel guilty for that, or do you need someone who helps you feel like you really can come back from what you've done? That's the difference between just taking a therapeutic stance versus actually becoming a coach. When you're working with the offending parents, a lot of times they need that supportive push as well as that, hey, this is the boundary, which we normally would give. Next, let's talk about some of our actions we're going to take. So how many of you are familiar with motivational interviewing? This is a technique that has, 5 basic steps, but it was really founded and developed by psychologists William R. Miller and Stephen Rolnick. It was really designed to address the significant challenge in helping clients affected by addiction. What they found is that they really a lot of times had some motivation to make positive changes, but they really struggled with that consistency. So what they decided to do was assume that motivation is a spectrum and that change can occur even if there is some ambivalence to the changes that you are initiating. A lot of times when we're working with offending parents, we assume that they have to completely decide that they are wrong and that they have to stick with that and have to focus on that. In those early stages of building that therapeutic alliance, sometimes you're going to struggle to get that from them because they haven't come to terms with the mistake that they've made. If you can't get over that, it's hard to get them to a place where they really will have that sustainable change. So we want to focus on some motivational interviewing techniques because we want to make sure that we give them time for that. So the first step is building rapport. Now understand this is a cyclical process. So that means that you'll kind of go in and out of these different steps. It's not like you're going to just kind of check off the build rapport and you never have to go back to it. Sometimes you have to kind of go back to the build rapport a couple times during the process, especially as you're kind of digging in deeper a little bit therapeutically. That rapport can be built with lots of things, but one of our best ways for building rapport is reflective listening, using those phrases like, it sounds like, if I hear you correctly, if I'm understanding correctly, this is what you said. Make sure that you're building that rapport. That also might include listening to their side of the story. When I start with a family who I've been contracted to work with through the Department of Child and Family Services, what I usually say when I come into the home, first thing is, okay, tell me why I'm here. They assume that I've gotten, the story 10 times over from the Department of Child and Family Services and everyone else's opinion, and that I've formulated an opinion of them before I come in the door. I really make a great effort to read as little as possible about a family before I get there, so that they don't feel that judgment as soon as I walk in the room. That helps me to build rapport a little bit better with the families, because they do feel like they have an opportunity to have a conversation and to make their own statement. The next thing you want to do is assess readiness. This is really helpful as you're deciding when you're ready to reintroduce the kids into this process, if you're going to get to that point or not. Having conversations, asking questions, listening to them, the way they describe making changes. Let's just use physical discipline for an example. Are they ready to not physically discipline their children because they, if they come from a family where this is the norm, they might start by saying this, it was good enough for my mom, it was good enough for my dad, it's good enough for me. They may not be ready to hear how 1, 2, 3 magic is the best thing that you've ever used, because they're still believing that they have to do what mom or dad does. You're going to have to spend some time focusing on the good and the bad of what mom or dad did to get them to a place where they're ready to hear some of the alternatives. Next, you want to talk about their motivation and their confidence. What I find a lot of times is that there's more motivation than there is confidence. And that's why we use that coaching approach where when a client isn't feeling like they are their best version of themselves, you really do want to give them an opportunity to build some confidence. Give them some small wins. I love using worksheets and small homework assignments, because when a client does a small worksheet or a small homework assignment, that shows me that they are motivated. I can then come back and praise them or affirm them for the work that they've done, which builds that confidence. A lot of times we don't use tangible techniques. Everybody doesn't get the same benefit from talk therapy, but every time you give someone an opportunity to succeed, you're building that relationship a little bit more. Next, let the parent identify the problems and the solutions. Look, if you're involved with this family because they have an open DCS case, you already know what some of the problems are, but they maybe only see one solution. So help them explore possible solutions. Act like you're kind of inquisitive, let yourself not be quite so serious, not be so much the authority or the superior person in the situation. Help explore it with them and let them identify some things that they think might work. And then lastly, always, always, always identify what's going to be your next step and how you're going to follow up. So if they think a solution might work, how are you going to test that theory? And then make sure that you come back around and follow up with that. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about questions. One of the things that we sometimes do is we ask questions that we already know the answer to. That's not helpful. It's not helpful for us or for our clients. I remember being in grad school and having the professor actually count the questions that we would have in a session. So you become super aware of how many questions you ask. But after you've gotten out and kind of into practice, a lot of times we go back to those old routines of just question after question. And for someone who's really trying to figure out where they want to go and what they want to do, asking too many questions or asking questions in the wrong way can actually hinder you from building that connection. So you want to be authentically inquisitive, right? So that means give them some time to express things to you, and then ask them the way that you would ask, someone who you would consider a friend. Don't ask questions just for the sake of asking. Don't dumb down your conversation. Be authentically inquisitive. Ask where some of these things came from. When was the first time you experienced that? Or how did you feel when you were getting spanked? Those kind of things. That does allow them to have that deeper processing, and you realize sometimes that they never have had that thought. And so you're helping them through your questions and not hurting them. Encourage reflection by also being reflective. When you see something, reflect what you're seeing, right? It seems like to me you're getting physically uncomfortable right now. Can you tell me a little bit about what's going on? A lot of my clients have never been present. If you've ever done any work with mindfulness, a lot of my clients, particularly the offending parents, they know that something inside of them happens and they need to spank their child, but they don't know exactly what it is. So just being present with them and calling out what you see, that can actually help them to understand a little bit more of the process. Remember, you can validate without agreeing, right? You can say, I can understand why you feel like that, and still not say that that's okay to feel that way. You can validate those feelings. It looks like you're feeling scared right now, or you're feeling frustrated right now. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're justifying what they're feeling, but you can validate. And these are things that we would do in therapy with anyone. And these definitely do help when we're talking about working with offending parents. And using appropriate self-disclosure is helpful. I've worked with some parents recently who were involved with some physical discipline that was inappropriate. And I made the disclosure that I stopped physically disciplining my children after years of believing that that was appropriate. And I talked about why. So when they looked at me, they were kind of surprised because a lot of people assume that if you're in child welfare that you've never spanked your children, or we all believe that everybody should go to timeout. But I developed this belief system, and I talked about my kind of process of developing that. That was an appropriate use of self-disclosure so they can understand some of the other reasons why this might not be the best benefit to them. That's helpful for your clients. What's not appropriate is telling them that you're struggling at the same time, right? If you are too open with those problems, they begin to lose hope. So if it's something that you've resolved, that's definitely a place where you can share it. A few final thoughts. So I do like to talk about this. I talked a little bit about it when we were talking about building rapport. The fact is, shame is not helpful or necessary in the healing process. If anything, I think it actually can hinder the process. Taking responsibility is helpful because it allows you to see how you can control a future outcome that will be better than where you are right now. But feeling shameful just really puts you in a position of being powerless. So we want to focus on not encouraging shame in our clients, but always encouraging them to take responsibility, which means that they also have control. Remember that change is a process. It's not an event. When we talk about that motivational interviewing, you're going to go in and out of those cycles. You're going to have a plan that's sometimes going to need to change. It's going to need some revision. This is a process that continues. This will continue over time for years. I remember when I was working in healthcare, a lot of times we would talk about how the wound that heals on the outside, you got a cut or a stitch or something, that wound that heals on the outside, it looks great and wonderful, but that cellular process beneath the skin, that continues on essentially forever. That never goes away. So all these changes that are occurring will continue, and that's not a bad thing because we can continue to adjust. And then this last one I love to leave. Anytime we're working with kids, a lot of the times we're talking about transiency. You might have a child that you're working with and then they move to a different foster home and you're not a part of their life anymore. Some of us will plant, some of us will water, some of us will harvest. So some of you are planting some seeds right now with offending parents, and you may never see that seed produce a beautiful plant in the future. But I want you to know that nothing that we do good is ever returns to us void. So focus on always either planting, showing that seed some water, or looking to kind of create the harvest for your client. Now, lastly, I did want to share that I do have 2 books available, Drag 'em Kicking and Screaming and Authentically Engaged Families, both really focus on a lot of what we talked about today, which is building relationships. And I think that it benefits us working with children and families and improving outcomes. I would love to stay in touch with you. You can find me on social media at Fam and Biz Coach and on either my website, CatherineDay.com or thewelltoday.com. I've enjoyed speaking with you today. Have a great day.